Hi everybody, this is Ethan from the Bancho Boys here. So this is a MetalGarurumon card-by-card tier list. I've been playing the deck competitively since BT9, and I've noticed with EX5 and BT15, there's been a lot of renewed interest in the deck. I wanted to take some time to talk through every possible card that you can run in MetalGaruru, even some ones that you probably shouldn't. This is not a deck list video, this is instead a deck guideline to help you through the process of creating your own MetalGarurumon deck. So let's get right into it. Okay, so before we get into the tier list itself, I wanted to discuss the criteria that I'm using. The first thing I want to mention before I talk through these is that just because a card is in A tier doesn't mean that it's worse than S tier. Similarly, just because a card's in B tier doesn't mean it's worse than A tier. These are just guidelines to help decide how common a card should be in a build, how likely you are to want to include it. So talking through each of the different tiers, in S, we have S for standard. These are going to be cards that are going to be included in pretty much all builds. You'll see these in basically every list. These are normally the strongest options, but they're just kind of ones that you need for one reason or another. A is for acceptable. These cards are great cards to use. They're really good options, but they're not quite at the S tier of just being automatic includes. Still, these are probably where you're going to want to pull most of your cards for when you're trying to fill out the remaining slots after you've put in your S tier cards. B is for build dependent. These are cards that you have to build around in some capacity to make work. They can be just as good as A tier cards if you make the necessary choices, but you need to make those choices to make these cards perform as well as they should. C is for can't recommend. These are cards that are not directly outclassed by a higher tier card. They do something unique, but they're just not really at the level to be worth including. It's hard to justify a slot on one of these cards. And then D tier is for don't run this. Moving on. But no, in seriousness, D tier is going to be the cards that are outclassed or they're just not contributing to the normal plays or win conditions of the MetalGarurumon deck. Before I start ranking cards here, I wanted to mention that this tier list is based on the BT15 format post the March 1st ban list, which means that Bukamon is limited, Gabumon, EX5 Gabumon X and Garurumon X are also limited. And of course, the promo where Garurumon is still limited as well. I'm going to discuss the cards by type and level. So we'll start with level 2, level 3, so on and so forth, and we'll wrap up with options at the very end. To start with, let's look at the level 2s. So we have 3 different Tsunomons to discuss. The first is ST2 Tsunomon. So this is the Starter Deck 2 Tsunomon. And this one is just really terrible. It's going right in D tier. No reason to consider it. The next two are BT5 and BT15 Tsunomon. So both of these gain 1k DP. BT5 is your turn. You just always get 1k DP. And BT15 is when a Digimon card adds a card to your hand by effect, then you get 1k DP that lasts through the end of your opponent's turn. So BT15, it's basically just a direct retrain improvement of BT5 because you're going to add something to your hand pretty much every turn. So that extra 1k that lasts through your opponent's turn is going to put it in a higher tier just to give an little extra DP for blockers or things like that. So we'll put BT5 in D tier just because it has now been outclassed. And BT15 is going to go into A tier. This is going to kind of be our best Tsunomon option for the deck. Next up, we have BT14 Bukamon. This card is pretty crazy. It gives jamming on an egg, which is just wild. Of course, this card was limited on the most recent ban list, and with good reason, but you're going to want to run the one copy that you have available. This is definitely going right in S tier. And then the last egg I wanted to discuss is the BT11 Wanyamon. So this is a bit of an odd card you might not think of immediately when you think of the deck, but where this card really shines is when you include it alongside the EX1 Garurumon. So EX1 Garurumon plays a 3-cost mat from hand for free when attacking as its inherit. But the issue with that is then you can't immediately trigger the mat because you're not going to draw unless you are lucky enough to have a BT15 Gabumon in your stack to then immediately trigger the draw. BT15 Wanyamon helps you avoid that issue by just giving you a draw as soon as you swing, which allows you to then trigger the mat that you just played. So as you might guess, this one's going to go into B tier. This one is a card that you have to, you don't have to include, but is good to include with the EX1 Garurumon. Probably not that much reason to include it over the Sunomon otherwise. All right, moving on to level 3s. We've got quite a few different Gabumons to discuss here. The very first one I'll mention is BT6 Gabumon, so we'll just go ahead and get this one out of the way. This is a Gabumon card. Amazing in Gabumon, S tier there, but for Metal Garuru, it's a D tier card. Really no reason to include it here. Then we have ST2 Gabumon and P003 Promo Gabumon. Both of these are Source Strip cards. ST2 has Source Strip as an inherited effect. The promo one has Source Strip as an on-play effect, but both are bad. Both are going right into D tier. There's really no reason to run these cards in this deck. Source Strip is a mechanic that was included in very early Metal Guru cards, but has been abandoned in later stuff. You'll see that trend with a couple other mechanics as well, and it's just not something you want to really build your deck around. So those are going in D tier. Then we have BT1 Gabumon. So this is the first of a set of on-play draw or searcher cards. And BT1 Gabumon himself is an on-play draw card. So that's really not bad. It works in conjunction with the BT15 mat. Since you are automatically drawing a card, you can just play it, trigger every mat you have, and essentially reduce its play cost by 1 for each mat. So that's actually pretty decent. However, just drawing the next card on your deck is generally not going to be preferred to searching for a specific engine piece. So this one's going to go into C tier. Following that, we have the BT5 Gabumon, which is kind of a similar card, satisfies a similar role of being an on-play card, except that in this case, this one searches the next 3 cards for for a Garurumon and an Omnimon. So you can actually get 2 targets if you're lucky. And similar to the BT1 Gabumon, if you have Matt on the board and you hit your search, which you most likely will, you then can trigger the mat to gain some memory back. So this one's kind of cool now because it's an on-play searcher that you can actually discount, which is not something that most decks have. So this one's pretty cool. Goes right into A tier, just a solid searcher, solid slot fill for Gabumon. Lastly, among the searchers, we have the promo P042 Gabumon. This one reveals the top 5 cards of your deck and adds a Tamer to hand. This one's pretty bad. The issue is, adding a Tamer is nice, but you would much rather be just trying to search for an engine piece if you're playing a card. Like if you're playing a rookie, chances are that you're doing so because you're missing a piece to go up your line, or you're trying to set up further, and grabbing a Tamer, even though that's not bad, that's not really the best way to do that. So this one's going to go into D tier. It's honestly worse than either of the other 2 options we just discussed. After that, we have EX1 Gabumon. So this one's pretty interesting. It has an inherited when attacking effect that reveals the top 3 cards of your deck. You can add a card with Gabumon in its name or a Tamer card from among those to your hand. So the main idea with this one is that you combo it with the EX1 Garurumon to attack. You search your deck, you add a mat to hand, and then you immediately free play the mat with the EX1 Garurumon inherit. So that's a fairly cool combo, but it is one that in order to maximize the value of this card, you are going to have to build around. And as a result, this one goes into B tier. Next, we have ST8 Gabumon. ST8 Gabumon, kind of an odd bird among the Gabumons. It's the only one that gives a DP buff. As an inherit, it gives you an all turns 1k DP if you have 8 or more cards in your hand, which with all of our draw effects is very easy to satisfy, even fairly early into the game. And this one's actually, quite good. It's not as strong as the best option for the deck, which we'll get to in just a second. But it's still a solid Gabumon. helps increase the threshold for your blocker, also increases your DP for when you're swinging into security, so you're less likely to have to burn your battle protection, which with us having to swap back to the old style BT9 battle protection with the most recent limits, that's actually more relevant now than it would have been, say, in the pre-ban list format. And as a result, this one's actually going to go into A tier. Kind of an uncommon DP boost for the deck. We don't really get a lot of those. Next up is BT15 Gabumon. And spoilers, this is going to be the best Gabumon for the deck. So it does a couple different things. The first is at the start of your main phase, you can pick one Digimon to gain blocker. It actually doesn't have to be itself, so you could pick a different Digimon if there's a strategic reason to do so. Additionally, if you control Matt Ishida, you also draw one card. So what this does is if you already have the BT15 Matt on the board, you can just immediately trigger every BT15 Matt you have and gain memory. So it can be like extra free memory at the start of your turn. But as a note, you gain the blocker regardless of whether you have the Matt or not, so that's actually pretty cool as well. Its inherit is fairly plain. It's just a draw one when attacking, but we actually don't have a ton of good Gabumon inherits. So having just a flat draw one is actually pretty nice. It also means that you can immediately trigger your mats with that as well. If you already had this lower in the stack and you didn't have mat out yet, or you could use this in conjunction with the EX1 Garurumon, like I mentioned earlier, to play the mat and then immediately get a draw to trigger it. So just a good, solid all-around card, kind of an uncommon way of getting blocker in the deck. We don't have a ton of different ways to do that, especially at lower levels. I think this is the only one. So this one goes right in S tier. Then we have ST16 Gabumon. So this is going to be the last of the standard Gabumon cards before we get into the X antibody forms. And this one is kind of a little bit of an unfortunate card. So it's purple, which means that it's going to be a little difficult to actually try to include in a blue-based deck, which is kind of where the deck is at now. With the limits to EX5 Gabumon and the other limits to ST6 and BT2 Gabumon, there's just really no way to try to play purple base anymore. So you can still run this card in blue base, thankfully, since it does Digivolve on top of Sunamon, but it's just a hard sell. Really good effects. If it was blue, it would definitely be A tier, but unfortunately, since it's purple, it doesn't work with our boosts, our trainings, or anything like that. It's going to go into... Okay, so getting into the X antibody forms for Gabumon. First, BT9 X antibodies. So BT9, funnily, if this had been a pre-ban list, tier list, that would have gone directly into C tier because it's pretty outclassed by EX5 Gabu-X. But with Gabu-X now being at 1, the original BT9 one is now being back in the deck. It's filling in for those slots that we lost. It actually is still a pretty solid card. It reveals the top 3 cards of your deck on play or when digivolving, and then adds to hand a Garurumon and then either an a Guru or an Omnimon and then an X antibody. So you can pick up either a Garuru or an Omnimon piece, depending on what you need, and then you can pick up the X antibody option if you happen to reveal that. So it's one of the few ways to actually search the X antibody option in the deck, and it's also pretty much required just to fill out for those slots that we lost from the EX5 limits. So this one is going to go right into S tier. Just a solid card, helps us pick up extra stages for battle protection as well, which is great. Then we have EX5. This card is amazing. The search is great. You reveal the top 4 of your deck, and you pick up up to two cards with Garurumon or X antibody in the name. So you can pick up, obviously, Garurumon. You can also pick up a card with X antibody in the name, which could be the option, or it could be like Omnimon X antibody, something like that, right? That's pretty nice. If you do pick up something with the effect, you then trash 1, which is good for fueling its own battle protection effect, which is really the most notable thing about it, is its battle protection inherit. Once per turn, when you would be deleted in battle, you can return any 2 non-egg cards from your trash to the bottom of your deck to prevent that deletion from happening. This is extremely easy to fuel. It doesn't have to be in archetype cards that you're returning, so you could actually, return a training to the bottom of your deck if you needed to, whatever you need to do there. In longer games, this is actually pretty nice for helping to restock your deck. When your deck's starting to get really thin, you can put in the cards that you want to draw so that maybe if the game goes on really long, you actually draw back around into those. So just an amazing card. Really unfortunate that it was limited. I was surprised. I assumed it would just be the Garurumon X that got limited, but unfortunately this one was as well. But you definitely run the one copy that you have. Still a lot to talk through. To start with, we'll go ahead and knock off a couple of the D tier ones. BT1 Garurumon. This one goes in D tier. This one, when it's on play, you can unsuspend when you're Digimon. So this is an old mechanic from the BT1 MetalGarurumon where it would play a card out of sources. So the idea was you would attack, you would play this out, you would unsuspend yourself. But this mechanic has been completely, it's not used anymore in the MetalGarurumon deck. It's just been set to the side. So really no reason to try to include that here. And then the ST2 Garurumon is another source strip Garurumon like the two Gabumons we discussed earlier. This one is a bit better than the Gabumon because it can strip any level, whereas the Gabumon could only strip 5s and below. And it actually doesn't have a turn limit, which is funny. So if you swing a bunch of times in a turn, you can actually strip off a bunch of sources. But still, there's just really not much reason to try to use this one over any of the better options. It falls into D tier. BT5 Garurumon. So this one was at one point pretty standard in pretty much all Garurumon builds at least a couple copies, if not more. And it's a fairly solid card. So when digivolving, if you have Gabumon in the sources, you gain back a memory. So that means it effectively costs 1. And this has actually gotten even better with training because you could, use training to digivolve into it for free and then gain back a memory. And then its inherit is an all turns 1k DP, which is pretty nice. You just, a free 1k DP for no reason. However, the issue with this card is that we kind of just have better options now. Like this one is really, again, like I said, it's not a bad card, but we just have better options, particularly if you're trying to work around the new BT15 mat. You really want to have effects that either play it or effects that let you draw to then trigger it. And so spending a slot on this card that doesn't do either of those things is a little hard to justify. As a result, this one is going to go into C tier. But again, I want to stress this isn't a bad card. It's just kind of outclassed. Next up, I'll discuss EX1 Garurumon. This is one we kind of talked about a couple times before with the EX1 Gabumon and the Wanyamon. When attacking, you can play a mat with a play cost of 3 or less from your hand for free. So the really nice thing about this is that you can do this even if you already control a mat, unlike the BT15 Guru we'll discuss in a moment. And that means that you can just throw one out there, get a free search when you do that. That's pretty great. The thing with this card, though, is that it's replacing your slot that is typically going to be your draw slot. So when you replace that, you have now decreased the likelihood that you can actually trigger a draw to then trigger your mat. And so that ends up being kind of a counterintuitive issue to the card because it makes mat better, but it also makes mat harder to trigger. So as a result, this one ends up going into B tier. You have to kind of build around it a bit to really maximize its usefulness. You might want to include Wanyamon if you're wanting to have a higher likelihood of drawing, and you might also you likely also would want to include EX1 Gabumon to help you have a higher chance of actually having a mat in hand to even free play with it. Okay, then we have BT15 Garurumon. I discussed this one a bit just a moment ago, but what this one does is when digivolving, if you do not control a mat or card with mat in name, then you can play a card with mat in name from your hand for a reduced cost of 3. And so what you're normally going to be playing with this card is the BT15 mat, which is a 3-cost card, so that means it becomes free at that point. And that's pretty nice because as soon as you play it, you instantly trigger its search effect, which means that you can then grab another piece from the top of your deck, which is awesome. The alternative effect it has when digivolving is if you do control a mat, you instead draw 1, which means that if you don't control a mat, you free play 1. If you do control a mat, you draw 1, which means that you trigger your mat and you then gain a memory off of it. And so that's a really nice combination. That makes this a little bit of an improvement over something like the BT12 Greymon or some of the other cards that have been designed like this, because most of those were designed where, well, if you already had the card, then it just did nothing. But this Garurumon actually still does something even if you already have the mat on field, which is pretty nice. And it also allows it to kind of function as a bit of a replacement for the BT5 Garurumon, because since it will digivolve and then if you trigger your mat, you automatically gain back a memory. That kind of falls into the same field as the BT5 Garuru gaining a memory on digivolve. So that's pretty nice. And of course, if you control multiple mats, you're going to get to trigger all of those. So you can potentially be gaining a lot of memory if you use training to go into this card, for example. You might be able to gain 1 or 2, something like that. In addition to all of that, it has a once per turn when attacking draw inherit, which is pretty nice. It's not the infinite draw of the promo Garurumon, but it is still just a nice free draw and a way to trigger mat on board if you have this card as part of a stack. This one is definitely going to go into S tier. I think there are still other strong Garurumon options, but the thing with this one is that it's pretty much going to be an auto include in all builds at least 2. You're going to want it there just to get out your mats for free. So that puts it in the S tier. It's going to be it's going to be run in pretty much every build in at least some capacity. Then we'll move on to the promo Garurumon. So I was just kind of discussing that one a bit. It is pretty strong still. It's still one of your best Garurumon options. Its inherit is just when attacking, draw 1, no turn limit. So this was kind of a notorious aspect of the deck back in the day, where you would just swing and draw and swing and draw and swing and draw just repeatedly. So you draw through and your hand suddenly 12 plus cards and 16 cards or something like that. So that was pretty crazy. This card is still good for that reason. It works in conjunction with the BT15 mat, which I have been mentioning a lot. This is your level 4 slot is the slot that interacts with that card the most. So that's kind of why it's come up a lot here. But the fact that this one does trigger a draw for that is really great. It's also really good if you have to digivolve and raising, because you're losing out on the when digivolving effect of your BT15 Garurumon. But with the promo, that doesn't matter because it just has an inherit. And its inherit, of course, is better since you're infinite drawing, unless you're trying to avoid milling out or something like that. It also only has a play cost of 4, which is pretty great for a level 4. It's not something you really want to do, or certainly not frequently, but there are situations where dropping a level 4 for 4, either because you've bricked on a 3 or you're trying to set your opponent to a certain amount of memory or something like that, can be useful. So that actually does come up more than you would think. This one is going to go into A tier. I want to go ahead and say for there might be some contention in the Metal Guru community over this placement, but I think this one is a borderline S tier card. However, you don't actually have to include it in your you can instead, if you wanted to, you could just run like BT15 and EX1, and that would still be a perfectly competent lineup. And that's why I feel like Promo Garurumon really belongs more in the A tier. But don't get me wrong, this is still a very strong card. You could easily run it at 4 and it would feel great. Like you're not going to have issues with this card at all. It's just not 100% mandatory, and that's why it falls into the A tier. All right, next we have the ST16 Garurumon. So this one has some similar issues to the ST16 Gabumon in that it's purple. So the problems with it being purple. Firstly, it cannot be searched by boost or training or Davis if you run that. And you also cannot use training to reduce costs going into it. So that's really unfortunate, just because it's you're not going to be able to discount going up into it, which means you're always going to have like at least 2 or maybe 1 if you've got some other way to gain memory to be able to even just go up into this one. With trainings being such omnipresent cards, not working with it is a big downside. In addition to that, some of the level 5s that you want to run cannot directly digivolve on it. A lot of the older 5s, for example, specifically just say level 4 blue. They don't have the alternative digivolution condition that a lot of the newer cards do. Just like with the Gabumon, this makes it difficult to justify putting in your deck. Pretty unfortunate, because if it was blue card or even half blue, like purple blue, then it would be probably easily an A tier card. But since it's not, it's going to go into All right, after that, we're going to get into the two Garurumon X antibody cards. The first is BT9 Garurumon X. So this card, but compared to the EX5, it looks it looks absolutely wimpy, but it's still good. This card was one of the things that made Garurumon such a strong deck back in the day, back in like BT9, BT10, because it was basically kind of like pseudo jamming. You would go and swing through your opponent's security, and as long as you weren't dying in battle like a bunch of times, you were going to be able to continue to battle protect and just chunk through all their security. Or similarly, it could allow you to kind of ignore blockers, even big blockers, because if they only had one block, well, you were going to swing multiple times. You could battle protect the one block that they were going to do, and then you could just continue to swing past at that point. And that's still the case. And with the EX5 card going to 1, that of course is going to propel this one into the S tier. I'll go ahead and say it's going to fill out for the remaining slots that you lost with the EX5 limit, similar to the Gabu X, and it's still pretty solid. I don't think I mentioned, but the way the battle protection works is you have to remove 2 cards with the same level from your sources to avoid dying in the battle. So you could remove 2 3s, 2 4s, so on and so forth. This one is, like I said, definitely weaker than the EX5. If they ever unlimited EX5, which I don't think they will, but if they ever did, this card would immediately go to like D tier. There would really be no reason to run it, but with it at 1, it's suddenly back in S tier. So there you go. And with that, we have the EX5 Guru X, which of course this one is S tier. This card is insane. I knew it was going to be limited, as soon as it was revealed. I'm like, I wanted it to be good. It was almost exactly what I asked for. It's actually better than what I was predicting, because I thought it would, draw 1, discard 1, but it's draw 2, trash 2, and I was like, oh, okay, well, that's even better. But unfortunately, I knew as a result that was going to cause it to get hit. And in fact, it was even more abused than I anticipated, being used as a base in practically every purple deck, and also the notorious Apocalymon. So yeah, this card was a victim of its own success, if you will. Its effect, just to kind of get into it really quickly, like I mentioned, when digivolving, you draw 2, trash 2. So when you digivolve into this card, it's pretty crazy because you just immediately draw 3 cards, 1 for the one for the digivolve, and then 2 for the effect. And then you just have to trash 2 from your hand, which means that you immediately make its battle protection live. It has the exact same battle protection as the EX5 Garurumon I mentioned earlier, so you return 2 from trash to deck to not be deleted once per turn. So that part of it is amazing. It makes that battle protection viable in even a blue-based deck, which otherwise wouldn't have very much trashing, just because you can trash 2 cards right then, and so you're filling up your trash pretty quickly. The other thing that it does is, if you have Garurumon in the sources, then you also gain 1 memory. And so that's just crazy, right? Because you digivolve on Garurumon, you do so for free. You draw 2 cards, you trash 2 cards, and then you gain a memory. So you're getting a positive memory for this. It's very reminiscent of the BT11 Greymon X, and kind of what it did to that deck's stack building. In terms of its power level, and it's also limited, like that card is too, so no surprise there. But yeah, like I said, S tier, amazing card. I don't think it's ever going to come back from 1. Hoping maybe Gabu X someday, we'll see. But yeah, just a really good card, and you hope to get it in your hand. All right, so that's it for the level 4s. So we'll go ahead and move on to the level 5s. So we've got a lot of rare Garurumons to talk through here. The very first one I'll mention is ST2 Rare Garurumon. Excuse me, actually this one is going in the C tier, not the D tier. And you might be wondering, okay, why C tier? This one is also a source strip card, right? Well, the thing with this one is its inherit is if your opponent controls a Digimon with no sources, then you get security attack +1. Why is it C tier and not D tier? The main reason is that, well, 2 things. 1, security attack plus is very hard to come by in this deck. The only other card that gives it is the promo Rare Garurumon, which has been limited. And obviously, when you're swinging multiple times per turn, security attack plus is pretty crazy. So that's thing 1. It is a way to give security attack plus, which is a great effect. And then the second thing is that, if you're playing against decks that are playing a lot of sourceless bodies, so for example, something like Royal Knights, or maybe the new, it's not out yet, but the 7 Great Demon Lords, when that deck becomes a thing, that'll be hard slamming bodies. Like, it feels like hard slamming has become a lot more common than it was at one point. So even if you're not source stripping stuff, you could still be making use of this card. The reason this kind of goes into C tier instead of B tier is that it's, even if you, well, I'll say it this way, if you don't build around it, then you're going to just be totally dependent on what your opponent's deck plays like. If you do build around it, you're making your deck way worse. I've tried it out. It's actually interesting, but it's just not, you lose a lot of draw power and search power, so it's really not worth it. But this card can still be okay in a meta that was very favorable to it, and I don't think it's like the worst option ever. That's a really long justification for the C tier, but I did want to kind of talk through this a little bit because this would be an easy card to just completely overlook, but I actually think it's kind of interesting, and if it's something you want to mess around with, catch some people off guard maybe, it's not horrible. The next one up is the promo Weregaruru. This is also another Sec Attack Plus Weregaruru, and it's crazy. So to start with, when attacking, if you have Garurumon in the sources, you unsuspend once per turn. So it basically just gets an extra swing. You swing, you unsuspend. Now you can continue swinging from there. So that's crazy just from the get-go. Extra swings are amazing in this deck to help close game more quickly. Back in BT9 and BT10, this card was hated due to how easily it facilitated OTKs. And if this card was at 4 now, the deck would be absolutely insane. It's really just a crazy card because on top of giving that extra swing itself, if you have 8 or more cards in hand, then its inherit also gives you Sec Attack Plus. So the number of extra checks that this card is effectively allowing you to do per turn is, cannot be understated. And of course, I'll go ahead and throw it in here. This one is going right into S tier. We only have 1 copy. Of course, it is limited, but there's very little reason, almost I would say no reason to not include the 1 copy that we do have. Just a great all-around card, and yeah, really no negatives to say about it. If I had to say actually one issue is in the wake of that Weregarurumon being limited, the deck really doesn't have a definitive best Weregarurumon to run outside of that. Like, there's a bunch of different options that are all pretty solid, but none of them are just definitively, yeah, this is the best one. You use this to fill out the slots. With the Gabu X and the Garuru X that I discussed earlier, that was very easy because you just fell back to the old card. But with the Weregarurumon, it's not so obvious, and so you may end up running an array of different gurus. Actually, in my current build, I have several different one-ofs where I have 4 different Garurumons in the deck, and you'll notice other builds you'll see out there will be running something similar to that, or maybe they'll have 1/1 and something at 2, things like that. So lots of solid options. We're pretty fortunate with the Weregurus that there aren't any that I would say are bad. Really, like, they're all pretty decent. Even the ST2 isn't horrible, but there's not one that comes anywhere near the level of the promo Wereguru, really, at least not in blue base. And as a result, it's kind of just a hard decision on what to go with next. So if I had to ask for one thing for the deck at this point, I would love to have a really solid secondary Wereguru. But anyway, getting into it, we've talked about that enough. The first one I want to discuss is the SD16 Wereguru. So this is the purple Wereguru, and unlike the Gabumon and the Garurumon, this one is actually has more merit to including it. Now it does have the same issues as those two, where it's purple, which means that if you try to use it, it's going to make your searching more awkward, which is not great. It doesn't work with training, which is not great. But what it does in exchange for that is pretty great. So the first thing is when it attacks, you can trash a card in hand to unsuspend. So this is kind of similar to the PromoWare Garurumon effect. It's just a way to easily unsuspend yourself. In fact, it's actually more free since you don't have to have Garurumon in the sources. And so that's obviously really good. It's just an extra check. You could even potentially swing over something if you want to, because it starts at 8k DP, which is also pretty high for just a base level 5. And then if it gets boosted beyond that point, you can easily swing over some smaller things. So that's good. And then its inherit is very good as well. When attacking, you can trash 1 card in hand to delete a level 4 or lower. This deck is pretty sparse on removal until you get into the higher levels. So having an additional way to remove cards is really nice, even though it is an inherit. Having the ability to do that is pretty great. It can also help to clear the way for your MetalGuru X or your MetalGuru Ace to hit something that you really want to hit, because those only hit lowest level cards. So if there's like a level 3 or 4 hanging out there, but you want to get rid of the 6, then you're going to have to get rid of that 4 first. And the ST16 can help with that. So this is actually a pretty strong card. However, I'm going to be putting it in the B tier, and the reason for this is that if you choose to run this card, it might require some build considerations. So like I mentioned before, it doesn't work with training. So maybe you want to think about how you utilize the training. Do you still want to max out on it? Do you want to cut it down to 3, something like that? It also doesn't have like a draw effect of its own, so you're not going to be able to trigger mats with it. But basically just getting into this card without passing turn is a little bit harder. You might want to include things in your deck like memory boost or a memory setter or something like that, SD16 mat, things like that, to make it easier to get into this card without passing turn. But if you do manage to do that, then it's really strong, one of the better options. So even though it's going in B tier, it's definitely can be as strong as the A tier cards. And if this was blue, or if this was like a purple blue card, easily S tier. I think even at that point, it would honestly give the promo Garurumon a run for its money. But as is, I have to put it in the B. So getting into the large number of A tier Gurus, the first one we have is BT1. So like I said, this one is A tier. This one is a bit strange. It's kind of an interesting card. When attacking, this is its main effect, not an inherit, has no inherit, but when attacking, you gain 3 memory, but then at the end of your turn, you lose 3 memory. So it's kind of like Gravity Crush on legs, or like Gravity Crush and a half, which is pretty crazy, really, for just an effect. If you use that, you're most of the way to a level 6 already, just by gaining 3 extra memory. Or all of the way, depending on which one you're going into, but you're basically fueling your level 6 off of just swinging your 5. And then, of course, you can go into something to unsuspend to continue past that point. Now, the big downside of this card is that if you swing with it and you don't end the game, then you're probably going to lose. Like, you're very likely going to have something bad happen at a minimum, because you're going to be giving your opponent 3 memory on top of whatever you pass them with. So if you pass turn at 1, then they're going to be starting turn at 4, right? So that's pretty huge. That can make this card fairly risky. And I haven't played around with it too much myself because of this issue, but I do think it's a really solid option to consider, particularly if this sounds appealing to you. You can throw it in and do some crazy stuff. If you don't want to trigger its when attacking effect, then you can just not attack with it. Digivolve on top of it before swinging, and then you won't have to worry about that. So definitely a good card to consider. Also, on the memory gain side of things, we have BT7, Gururu, and EX. So these cards both go in A tier as well. They're very similar cards in terms of their inherit anyway. Their main effects are totally different, but their inherits both gain a memory. BT7 gains a memory when you unsuspend, and EX1 gains a memory when you attack. So BT7 is probably a bit favored when you're going up a line, so that you swing with it, you go into like a Were X, for example, and you immediately gain the memory when you unsuspend. That's pretty nice. On the other hand, EX1 is a little bit easier to trigger on subsequent turns because you just attack and then you immediately get the memory, even if you don't have a way to unsuspend after that point. So EX1 can be preferable there. Their main effects, like I said, totally different. BT7's is a bit strange. On play, if you don't control a blue tamer, you can play one from your hand. Or sorry, I think if you don't control a tamer, you can play a blue tamer from your hand for free. So probably not really going to want to do that because it would be a 7 play cost. But if you were in a strange position where you either like had a lot of memory, for example, or if you just were whiffing on a 4, then this one can be an okay hard drop for that reason. Also, if you do control a tamer already, instead of getting to play a blue tamer, you gain 2 memory. So basically at that point, it effectively costs 5. So it's actually not the worst hard drop if you have to, but that's not really something you ever want to do. The real reason you run this card is for the inherit, and you just hope the hard drop doesn't come up, though I have had it come up in tournament, and that's not great, but it at least makes it not feel quite as bad. DX1, on the other hand, its main effect is when digivolving, draw a card. So very simple. You just get an extra draw when you digivolve into it. But the thing that's pretty nice about this is that this does trigger the BT1 mat. So if, for example, you're sitting at level 4 in raising, you can move out your 4, you can digivolve into this, you can immediately trigger the mat and gain back some memory. So that's actually pretty nice in that scenario. And of course, the draws, you can't really complain about that anyway. But yeah, the main allure of these cards is their memory gain inherits, and they help make it a little bit easier to secure game by giving you that 1 extra memory to maybe go into something like MetalGarurumon X Antibody or something of that. And then the last of the standard Garurumon cards that I'll be discussing is Garurumon Ace. So this card actually has quite a lot going on. The first thing is that it has a 4 play cost because it is an Ace card. So you can play it from hand for 4 if you really need to. Of course, being an ace, it also has the ability to blast Digivolve during the counter timing, which is nice as well. And then as for its effect, its on play and when digivolving effect is that you draw a card, so similar to the EX1 Garurumon. But then if you have 5 or more cards in your hand, which you probably do, you trash a card. So this is actually a pretty cool design because the draw effect triggers BT15 mat, and the trash effect triggers ST16 mat. So if you're running both, you can trigger both of those and gain like 2 extra memory just off that one play, which is pretty cool. It also will trigger those cards on play as well, since it draws on play, which means that you can effectively reduce the play cost with Mat in that way. So that's pretty nice as well, because it drops for 4, but maybe you actually are able to drop it for 3 or 2 or something like that, which can be pretty nice. After that, it has an all turns effect, which is once per turn. When a Digimon effect adds a card to your hand, you can select, or you do select one of your opponent's Digimon and Tamers, or Tamers, excuse me, and then that Digimon or Tamer cannot suspend until the end of your opponent's turn. So that's pretty nice. It is really great against blockers because they can't block. It's really good, in stopping aggro. If your opponent has something that they're planning on swinging on board and you just stun it, okay, now it can't attack. And it also stops Tamers as well from suspending. So if they have a Tamer that's going to suspend to do something, then you can stop that from happening, which can actually be surprisingly effective in certain scenarios as well. As an example, if you're playing against MetalGarurumon, you can stun Analog Men, so then they can't redirect with it anymore, and so that's really great. Yeah, just a pretty interesting card. Also, like I said, that's an all turns effect. That's not a when digivolving effect. So if you have this card on the field, and then on like your next turn, you then add a card to your hand by a Digimon effect, it's going to trigger again. So that's actually pretty cool as well. The biggest downside of this card is actually that it's an ace. You don't really get a ton of value in this deck out of acing at level 5. Like, you're not normally going to want to be floating level 4s out on the board, unless maybe if you're split stacking, if you have a stack and raising and then like you have like a Gabumon with maybe BT15 Garurumon on top on the field, something like that. That might be a scenario where you can actually use the Blast Digivolve. But normally you're going to be using this just as a normal Digivolution or a hard drop from hand to pull off its effect. So you're not going to get that much value out of that. That's one downside. And then the other is that, of course, being an ace, it has an overflow. So when it leaves the battle area, you will overflow 3 memory, which is not great. Also particularly bad in a lot of ways for being on a 5. I feel like when it's your boss that's overflowing, even though you're overflowing more, it doesn't feel as bad because you've usually done something really impactful at that point. But with this card, sometimes it just feels kind of bad when your opponent kills it and you lose 3 memory. Because if you're in a position where you're going to lose the stack, it makes it a little difficult to justify going into this one. But still, even considering that weakness, I would still put it in A tier. It has a lot going on. Just the explanation of the effects obviously took a while there. It has a lot of utility that you're not really getting from most of the other Gurus. So it can just do some things that nothing else at this level anyway is capable of, and I think that earns it, for me, it earns it a spot in A tier. All right, that was the last of the standard Garurumon cards. So now we've got a couple more to look at, Sagittarius mode and then the X antibody. So I'll start with Sagittarius mode first. The first one I'm going to discuss is the BT5 Sagittarius mode. This was the original one that came out, of course, in BT5, and it's fairly interesting. It digivolves on a level 5 blue for 1, or on a level 4 blue for 3. And then if you have Garurumon in the sources, it has jamming. That's okay. That's not bad, right? The fact that it digivolves on a level 5 blue for 1 is actually kind of interesting, because it means that it can digivolve on top of Garuru X, which the other Sagittarius mode cannot. So that is one thing that this one has that's just kind of interesting. You could use this to go on top of the EX5 Garuru X to gain access to its unsuspend inherit at an earlier level than would normally be possible. So that's kind of neat as well. But it's still a little bit hard to justify running this card for a couple reasons. One is that it has jamming. That's cool. But unfortunately, it does not gain jamming. I really wish it gained jamming, because then you would gain it for the turn, and if you went up to Metal Guru, you would keep it. But that's not the case. It's just on this particular card. So if you go up, you lose it, and that makes it kind of worthless. The second issue is that it is not considered Garurumon. It is Garurumon Sagittarius mode, which means that Garurumon X cannot digivolve on it. And that's obviously hugely problematic, because it means that this card, if you put it on top of a Guru, you have now locked yourself out of going into X. So you don't want to do that. But if you have already gone into X, then the only reason to put this card on top of it would basically be that you're not then going to go into Metal Guru for whatever reason. Yeah, it's just kind of an awkward card to use. There's also the fact that it evolves on a 5-for-1. The other level 5s that do this kind of thing, the X antibodies and the other promo Sagittarius mode, well, 2 of those are going to do it for free. So you're having to spend 1 that you could maybe have been using to go into something a little bit more impactful. So as a result, I'm going to put this one in C tier. It is pretty interesting. It allows some sequencing that's not normally possible. I don't think it's straight up bad, but I don't know. I will say it is very, very borderline D tier. It could easily be in D tier. I just don't think it's, it's not the worst card ever. It's kind of like it would be like a goofy one of tech, I guess, if you want to include it. Now that brings us to the other Sagittarius mode. So a lot of the weaknesses that the original Sagittarius mode has, the promo Sagittarius mode does not. So for example, it digivolves on where Garurumon for 0 instead of 1, so that's great. It only digivolves on where Garurumon that way, so you can't put it on top of an X antibody, but you can go into this and then go into X antibody afterwards because it is also always considered where Garuru. So that's really nice. So you could do where Garuru, Sagittarius mode, and then where X on top, something like that, right? Additionally, it can also just go on top of a level 4 blue for 3, so it can basically act as a stand-in for Were Garuru itself because of the fact that it is also considered Were Garuru. So it's kind of nice. It's fulfilling a bit of a dual role there as both a Were Garuru but also a kind of a slide Evo on top of your. So that's pretty cool. Its main effect is pretty good. It has a wind digivolving effect that if you control a tamer, you can return up to 2 of your opponent's level 3 Digimon to the hand. So if your opponent has some level 3s on the field, you can just pop 2 of those back. Like I said, you do have to control a tamer, but that is going to be very common now with the BT15 mat. Maybe slightly less so before, but if anything, I think that effect's become easier to trigger. Though it is a little situational. It is mostly good against decks that are going to be putting out multiple 3s on the board, but it's still good against decks in general, for kind of similar to when I was talking about ST16 Were Guru earlier, just clearing the way for your X or your Metal Guru Ace to then kill other more important bodies. Yeah, so that's its main effect. Its inherit is the same inherit as the BT9 Guru X. So when you would be deleted in battle, you can trash 2 sources with the same level to battle protect. So that's pretty cool, because if you missed Guru X, this is a second way to pick up the battle protection. So that's nice. And then the other piece of that is if you lost the battle protection. So for example, if you swung earlier and you ended up having to trash the Guru X as part of your battle protection, you can then gain it back by going into this Sagittarius mode. So that's pretty cool as well. This one is going right into A tier also. It's very solid option, very easy to just throw in a build at 1 or 2 copies and not have any issues. I know some people also like to sometimes reduce their Were Garuru count to like 3 and then throw this in as a 4th card there, so you end up with like 4 Were Gurus, Sagittarius, and 3 Were X's. Personally, I always like to run 4 Were X's, but I know that is a little bit player preference. But in any case, yeah, this is just another solid option. As you can see here, we've got quite a few different Were Guru cards, even including ST16 here, all competing for those last 3 slots after the void with the promo limit left. So these are all pretty solid options. I can't really specifically say I would run 1 at 3 over any of the others. I think maybe doing some mix of some of these different cards is the way to go, but this is kind of where you're going to want to look regardless. All right, so moving on from there, we have the X antibody card, the Were Garurumon X antibody. The first one I'm going to discuss is the BT9 Were Guru X. So this one does a couple different things. Firstly, it can digivolve on Were Garurumon for 0, so that's pretty cool. And then when digivolving, it unsuspends. And then if you have Were Garurumon or X antibody in the sources, it also bounces one of your opponent's level 4 or lower Digimon back to the hand. So that's pretty great, right? You get an unsuspend, which means that you're getting an extra swing. You're getting a bounce, provided you meet the requirements, which is really nice. Particularly with low-level bodies, it's very common for them to have on-deletion effects or things like that where your opponent wants you to kill them. So bouncing can just completely play around that, which is pretty great. Yeah, there's really not a lot to complain about with this card. The biggest thing that has happened is that EX5, Were Guru X, has come along, which is going to be your favored Wereguru X. Like it's the one that you're definitely going to want to include. Whereas the BT9 is more like a if you want it in your build. I will say it is really nice to have the removal because the EX5 doesn't have any removal on it. So being able to get some low level removal before you get all the way up to level 6 is pretty great. The fact that it digivolves for 0 instead of 1 is pretty great, especially if you don't have like the protoform in hand to reduce the cost of the EX5 Werex. That can be nice. But even if you do have the protoform, you can actually go from level 4 to this Werex for just 2, then, which is kind of cool. You can protoform on a 4, digivolve into this, bounce something, things like that. So that's actually pretty nice, and does come up. Yeah, I think that's about all I have to say for this one. This one will go into A tier as well. Like I said, it's probably not the one that you would, you wouldn't run only this card. But if you choose to run it, you can definitely easily run a mix of it in EX5, and that'll work well. So with that, we have the EX5 Wereguru. This one is functionally similar in terms of the unsuspend. When digivolving, you can trash 2 cards to unsuspend. So rather than just automatically doing it, you have to trash 2 cards to do it. However, after you do that, if you have Weregurumon or X anybody in the sources, you can add 1 Digimon from your trash with either Garurumon or X anybody in the name back to your hand. So that's pretty cool. You can, you could trash 2 cards and immediately add one of them back if you just want to unsuspend and you don't need anything from trash. But if there's a particular card you want, you can then pick it back up. Which is kind of a couple notable things with that. The first is, since this is level 5, you can of course pick up a level 6 to then immediately digivolve into. So for example, if you've already used your level 6 and it's now sitting in the trash, you're on your second stack, you can grab it back that way. Or maybe you got unlucky and you haven't drawn into one, but your opponent hit one in security, now it's in trash, boom, there it is, you pick it back up, you're ready to go. The other thing that you can do, which is pretty cool, is with this deck, we have a lot of limited cards now. So you have the Gabu X, the Garuru X, and the Promo Wereguru, which are all at 1. This card can grab those back from trash, which can let you use them again in a second stack or maybe a third stack, whatever it happens to be. And that's pretty cool. Getting to just cycle cards back from trash isn't something that most colors outside of purple get to do. And of course, this card is half purple, but you're getting to run it in what is effectively a blue deck. So having a little bit of the purple trash cheating is a pretty nice pickup for this deck. But that's all of that is really the minor point in comparison to the true strength of this card, which is its inherit. Its inherit is pretty insane. When attacking, you can trash 1 card from your hand to unsuspend. Obviously amazing, because you can digivolve into a level 6, you swing the 6, you trash, and then you unsuspend, and then you swing again, then you go into MetalGaruru X, you unsuspend, you swing again, something like that, right? So you're picking up an entire extra attack from this. You are also potentially picking up an extra attack from its main effect when you unsuspend. So cumulatively, this card is giving you 2 extra strings, which is great for just closing game. It helps to really just clear out that last little bit of security, especially with Promo Weregurumon being limited. It makes it more consistent to do that on any stack rather than it being something that is only going to really be possible on a stack with an extra swing in there. So that's pretty great. The other thing that's really good about this is if you don't end the game right then, and the turn comes back around to you, then you're going to get another extra swing that turn, and that's just at that point the game should probably be over. It's very easy to end the game now if you're at if your opponent's at 4 security, because you can do something like discard, swing with whatever, unsuspend, swing again, unsuspend, swing again. If you're using the BT15 Metal Guru, now you've done 3 swings, go into Metal X, swing again, and then Omni for game, right? So this just makes it really easy to close game. As a result, S tier. Like I said, you can run a mix of this and BT9 Werex. I've personally found success with that, because BT9 Werex helps a lot against aggro rushdown decks. But the EX5 is going to be your definitely include this card, and I would not fault anybody for just running that at 4 and calling that a day. So that's a very solid S tier card. All right, so that's it for the level 5s. Now we have the level 6s. So kind of in contrast to the level 5s, most of the MetalGarurumons in the game are actually pretty bad, which is unfortunate. However, we do have a couple amazing ones, which are good enough to make up for the fact that the most of them are not. So starting off, we have BT1 MetalGarurumon, and this one is D tier. This is the one where I mentioned earlier, where you swing and you play a card out of sources. It's intended to combo with the BT1 Garurumon. But yeah, that's all it does. Just not really any reason to ever run that. Next up, we have the Promo MetalGarurumon. the card that I would not fault you if you forgot it existed, because it is a very kind of, it's a very odd card, I will say. It's just strange. So it has two things it does. The first is when digivolving, if you control a tamer, you draw two cards. So you just get, a free extra draw, or extra two draws, which, that's pretty nice. But that's it. It doesn't do anything after that. You just draw two. Okay, cool. I'm already at my boss, right? Then its other effect is that your opponent can't attack it. All right, again, sure, that's the thing. Maybe this was a precursor to the idea of giving the deck battle protection. I'm not really sure. But with the battle protection now, that effect is pretty pointless. This card in general is pretty strange, just not very good. After that, we have a couple cards that are pretty similar to discuss. The first is the BT5 MetalGarurumon. I should say specifically the blue one. I know there's another MetalGarurumon in BT5, which is not blue. I believe it's purple. But we're not talking about that one. We're talking about the blue one. And then also the EX1 MetalGarurumon. These cards do kind of similar things. They both bot deck cards with on-deletion effects. The BT5 one does it when digivolving. The EX1 one does it when attacking if you have 8 or more cards in hand and a tamer. I don't know why it has so many conditions, but regardless, those are the conditions. And then in addition to that, they both have different ways of gaining memory. The BT5 one has an inherit, where when attacking, you gain a memory. That's actually not horrible. It works with MetalGaruru X, so you can unsuspend, swing it, gain back a memory. That's okay. The EX1 MetalGaruru, on the other hand, when digivolving, gains 1 memory for each 4 cards you have in your hand. So if you have 4 cards, you'll gain 1. If you have 8 cards, you'll gain 2, so on. Which is pretty nice because most of the time you're going to be sitting at 8+ cards, which means it's generally just going to cost 2. If you happen to be at 12 cards, then it'll only cost 1, which is pretty nice. And then if you hit the fabled 16, then it'll be free. But obviously you're not going to do that too terribly often. So with these 2 cards, BT5, this one's going in D tier. EX1, I'm putting it in C tier. The reason I'm placing them like this is BT5, since it only bot decks on the initial digivolve, and also it only gains the memory as an inherit, that means that generally EX1 is just going to be cheaper, at least 1 cheaper, if not more. And it's also, if you just left it on the board, going with it multiple times, like over the course of multiple turns or something like that, then you could bot deck things multiple times potentially, which I think makes it favorable in that regard too. But really the biggest thing is just the fact that it gains the memory when digivolving. That kind of just makes it better. Now it's only in C tier, and the reason for that is it's kind of hard to justify running this card with MetalGarurumon Ace being a thing. So MetalGarurumon Ace, we can actually go ahead and talk about that now. So MetalGarurumon Ace is an interesting card. When digivolving, you can trash up to 3 cards in your hand, and then you gain 1 memory for each. Base digivolve cost is 3, and then you can trash 3 cards, which means that it becomes free, right? If you can gain the memory. So that's pretty crazy. You're going from level 5 to level 6 for nothing. That in itself is already wild and basically deprecates what the EX1 MetalGaruru was trying to do. But in addition to that, when attacking, you can trash 1 card in your hand to delete your opponent's Digimon with the lowest level. Really pretty great in a couple different ways. The first is that, like I said, it can be free. And then the second is it gives board control by deletion. It's also amazing against single stack decks, particularly those without protection or with very little protection, because what you can do is if you can get to level 5, which is very easy, right, to do most of the time. If you can get to level 5, that means automatically you can get to Ace, right? You just go up to it, boom, you're there, it was free. Then you swing and you blow up their stack. So now, it's like, wow, okay, there goes my stack, right? I don't have anything, and you're sitting with a MetalGarurumon on board with battle protection and maybe multiple swings, and anyway, it's a pretty crazy card and pretty crazy response. And all of that is without even mentioning the fact that it is an Ace card, which means that it can blast digivolve. This, in my opinion, is one of the stronger blast digivolve effects currently in the game. I do know there's some pretty crazy ones coming out down the pipe, but in terms of what's currently out in BT15, I still think this is one of the stronger ones personally. When digivolving, you get the same effect that you did on your turn, right? So that means that you can trash 3 cards from your hand, up to 3 cards, you gain 3 memory. So what that means, if your opponent attacks in, you have a Garurumon on board, you digivolve into the Ace, you blast digivolve into the Ace, you trash 3 cards, now you gain 3 memory in the middle of your opponent's turn. That's pretty insane, right? It can turn steel. If your opponent is at 2 or less memory, then you do that, boom, now it's your turn. That's obviously insane if your opponent doesn't anticipate it coming. But it's also just a very strong threat to have, even if you're not going to use it, even if you don't even have it in hand. The threat of the card being in hand means that your opponent now has to play around your board differently. If you have a level 5 sitting on board, they suddenly have to be really worried, like, oh, does he have Ace? Just a pretty strong card. The fact that it puts that threat on your opponent at all times is just pretty great. I will say, I'm only going to put this one in A tier. And the reason for that is that I do not feel that it is an auto include. You could very easily build a deck using only the BT15 Metal Garurumon and no Metal Guru Ace at all, and that deck would still be wrong. Because Metal Garurumon, the BT15 one, is a very powerful card. In that regard, Ace is an optional card, but I think it's still a really good card to consider. I personally would say I think it's worth throwing at least one in your build just for the threat, because if your opponent sees that you have it, now they have to play around it. If they don't know that you have it, if they haven't seen it, maybe it doesn't show up in game 1 or 2 and you're on game 3 or something like that, and they think, oh, well, he doesn't have ace, and then you ace them. Oh, right now you've caught them off guard that way too. So I think just having the threat there justifies running it at 1, but it is definitely not mandatory. So that's the A tier placement. Very, very solid card though. So moving on from there, I think we should go ahead and talk about actually, before we talk about the best Metal Guru in the deck, let's go ahead and talk about ST2 Metal Guru. So this one, when attacking, you unsuspend once per turn. That sounds really good. That's pretty strong. But this one is D tier because we got that on absolute crazy steroids in BT15 Metal Garurumon, which is already S tier. I'll just go ahead and throw it in there. BT15 Metal Garurumon is insane. It is one of the most loaded cards in the game, in my opinion, in terms of just the sheer number of effects. It's actually ridiculous. So firstly, when digivolving, you can select 3 of your opponent's Digimon and or Tamers, and then those cards cannot suspend until the end of your opponent's turn. So it's the same effect as where Garurumon Ace, but it stuns 3 instead of 1. If you're staring down a field of a bunch of bodies, boom, come out, you just stun all of them. Or you can stun their Tamers, which means they can't swing, not swing them. They can't suspend them for effects. But also, if you're playing against like a hybrid deck, they can hybrid on them, but they can't attack anymore. That on their next turn. You're playing against something like Shindramon. Okay, now they can't block you because you stunned their blocker, and they can't redirect you because you stunned their analog mans. It's just a pretty great effect. If you've ever played against Blue Flare, you know how good stun can be, and this one is actually an even better effect than what that deck has, because the Blue Flare stun specifically only prevents attacking and blocking, whereas this one prevents suspending altogether, which means that it prevents suspending for those reasons, in addition to suspending for an effect. So you can't suspend a Tamer to trigger it, and you can't suspend a Digimon that is stunned for Alliance or something like that. So that can actually be relevant in some situations, things like that. That's the first effect, which is already great. The second effect that I want to mention is that it has Evade. That is very good. Metal Garuru as a deck is notorious for being vulnerable to deletion, effect deletion. We have battle protection, for days, right? It's hard to just beat over a Garuru card, but you can blow it up with no concern at all. And so evade obviously helps with that. If your opponent tries to delete you, you just evade the deletion, and then they can't delete you that way. Now, we're still, of course, vulnerable to alternative removal, so bouncing, bot decking, throwing to security, anything like that. This, of course, does not stop, but it's still the case that a lot of decks, deletion is one of their main forms of removal. Anything that's like red, purple, very frequently, black, if they don't have de-digivolve, very frequently has to rely on deletion as well. So being able to just evade that in some matchups, it's just incredibly oppressive for the opponent. Which then brings me to the third effect, which is that it has an effect all turns, once per turn. When this card suspends, unsuspended. So yeah, that's that's pretty crazy, right? So when you're attacking, you get an extra swing. When you block, you unsuspend, you get an extra block. If you evade a deletion effect, like I was just talking about, you unsuspend from that as well, once per turn. It's just a very crazy effect to have. It's just pretty amazing, right? That's just strong, right? That's just really strong. And as if all of that wasn't enough, we still actually have one more thing that this card brings to the table, which is that if your opponent controls a Digimon with 10k DP or more, you can digivolve your Gabumon into this card for its digivolve cost, ignoring the requirements. So what that basically means is that if your opponent has a 10k Digimon, which would likely either be like a beefed up level 5 or probably a level 6, then you can just warp your Gabumon into this card. That's pretty insane. You can move a Gabumon out from raising and then warp into it, but you could also, if you have 3 in memory, then you play the Gabumon for 3, then just digivolve this on top immediately. That way, warp into it, stun some stuff. Now your opponent goes from being, maybe they were going to finish you off next turn, and then suddenly they can't. Lots of different applications there. Also worth mentioning that this is an additional Digivolution condition that becomes available under certain conditions. It is not a effect. It's not an effect that digivolves, which means that you can combo it with training. You can use training to digivolve your Gabumon directly into Metal Garurumon for 2. So you can tell that's a pretty insane effect. That is on top of everything else going on with this card. It's it's kind of like the BT14 Wargreymon, where it's just like a smorgasbord of effects, but the effects that we got here are just so good. Like the Wargreymon was okay. This is insane. This card is like every good thing that it could have had, it has. So yeah, S tier, easily S tier. Just a huge option to finally have in the deck. And I'm pretty happy with this too, because I feel like the deck has never really had a super good MetalGarurumon until like Ace. And then Ace was really good, but then Ace had the downside of being purple instead of blue. For the blue base, of course, that matters. And then also it has the overflow. So like I really like Ace, but Ace does have some issues. This card has basically no issues, other than it costing 4, I guess. But that seems like a reasonable balancing factor considering everything that else it has going on. So yeah, S tier. All right. With that, we come to the two MetalGarurumon X Antibody cards. The first one I'll discuss is BT9. So BT9, back in BT9 and BT10, was the main boss of this deck. The EX1 MetalGarurumon was like a secondary boss that was more of just like a midpoint between the two to help get into it for cheaper. But this was kind of the real boss of the deck. And I would in some ways say it has now kind of become a little bit of the secondary boss. Like the BT15 MetalGarurumon is maybe you could argue is now the stronger of the two, but the BT9 MetalGaruru X is still very good. So it does a few different things. Firstly, it can digivolve on MetalGarurumon for 1. So if you're already at MetalGarurumon, you can go up for 1. If you have Protoform, you can go up for free. So that's pretty nice. Then when digivolving, it unsuspends itself. So that's really good as well. That means you're going to get an extra swing. Additionally, on your turn, once per turn, when it unsuspends, if you have MetalGarurumon or X Antibody in the sources, you bounce all of your opponent's lowest level Digimon to the hand, not just one, all of them. So that's good in general because you're just bouncing a card. But if you happen to be playing against a deck that tends to play a lot of the same level Digimon onto the board, as an example, the Fanglongmon Deva deck has a lot of 5s or sometimes a lot of 6s sitting out. You can just bounce all of those at once, so that's really good. It is also pretty nice that it's a bounce effect as opposed to a deletion effect, since that means that you don't trigger any of those on deletes. So that's really good as well. And if your opponent is just not thinking and they kind of put their board into like a bad situation where they have like 2 3s and then like 4 or something like that, or 2 3s and a 5 or whatever, you can just bounce both of those 3s. Now they're down to just the one body, something like that, right? So, or if you have, this is kind of what I was talking about earlier with clearing the way with Sagittarius. If they have like a couple 3s and then a 6, well, Sagittarius bounces the 3s, this bounces the 6, things like that, right? There's lots of different ways to kind of pick apart your opponent's board with Garuru, and to me that's actually one of the things I really love about the deck, and what kind of makes me want to play it, I guess, is just the different ways that I can interact with disassembling my opponent's board. And yeah, I think this is a pretty cool card for adding to that. In any case, the last effect is when it digivolves, or when digivolving, it gains blocker until the end of your opponent's turn. That's pretty much just what it says. You pick up blocker for free, which is nice. It only does last for the 1 turn, so it's going to go away after that, but it still can be useful because since the card automatically unsuspends itself when you digivolve into it, if you either pass turn on that digivolve, or if you just choose to pass turn, you can then set up a blocker, which is pretty nice. Unfortunately, you are vulnerable to effect removal because you're no longer going to have the BT15's evade. But if your opponent needed to swing past, either for game or whatever it happens to be, suddenly you're preventing them from doing that, and that can always be a lifesaver. If you really need it. Normally, you're mostly just going to use this card for the extra swings and the removal, but the blocker does sometimes come up. This card is going to go into S tier. It is the primary MetalGarurumon X that you're going to want to run for most builds. Pretty much going to be at least at 2 in most builds, and as a result, it's going to go right there in the S tier. Now, the other MetalGarurumon X is not so good, unfortunately. It is interesting. It does a few different things, but it just is kind of awkward. So starting off, just go through the effects. The first thing is it just has blocker. It has blocker all the time, as opposed to only having it for the 1 turn. So that's kind of cool. If it survives multiple turns, you can just block with it every turn. Secondly, when attacking, you return a Digimon from your trash to the bottom of your deck. You delete one of your opponent's Digimon with the same level. So if your opponent has a level 5, you would return a 5 to the bottom of your deck, and then you delete it. Same thing for any other level. And then the last thing it does, which is kind of the most notable thing about it, when digivolving, if you have MetalGarurumon or X Antibody in the sources, you apply a blanket effect to your opponent's board where when they attack, they lose 4 memory. So it's basically a double Ice Wall. Ice Wall, normally when they attack, they lose 2. This card, they lose 4. That's pretty solid, actually. That's like the strongest aspect of the card, in my opinion. So the issues. Issue 1, it has blocker, but it doesn't automatically unsuspend itself. So if you want to utilize that blocker, you need to be unsuspended already. It doesn't have reboot or anything like that. Like I kind of feel like if this card had been like blue black instead of blue purple, it might have even been better. If it had a way of picking up reboot, because then you'd have the cool, reboot blocker shenanigans, right? But unfortunately, you don't have that, so you have to leave yourself unsuspended if you want to block. That brings me to issue 2, which is that it has that, and it has a win attacking effect. So in order to utilize its win attacking effect, again, you have to already be unsuspended. You would have to wing unsuspend yourself, like with Werguru or something like that. Werguru X, excuse me. And then Digivolve into this, and then swing to then trigger the win attacking. EX5 Werguru X helps with this issue because it is, unsuspends when Digivolving, and it also has an inherit to unsuspend yourself. So, you could like swing multiple times with it in that way. But I just feel like in comparison to the BT9 MetalGarurumon X, which is just immediately giving you an extra swing with no condition, that just is way better, basically, than this. Also, the removal is kind of awkward. You have to have the correct level in your trash, which with the purple variant of the deck would not have been as bad because, you'd be trashing all day, so you could very easily just put the correct thing in there. But with the blue version, that's a lot harder to actually pull off, particularly if you're talking about like some higher level cards. Like, what's the likelihood you have a 6 in there? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. What about a 7, right? You happen to just have a 4 in there, like, or did you bot deck it earlier for battle protection, or things like that, right? So just having to have the correct level in trash makes it a little bit harder to actually utilize its effect. So yeah, that's kind of the issues with the card. It doesn't give an extra swing, it doesn't unsuspend itself, its deletion is awkward. But all of that being said, I still think this card goes in B tier. And the reason for that is purely its Ice Wall effect. Against certain decks, particularly like aggro rushdown decks or multi-swing kind of decks, dropping an Ice Wall on your opponent is just going to stop them for a turn, right? Pretty much going to stop them. Now, that does mean that they're probably just going to turn around and spend that memory instead on removing your MetalGarurumon X. So now you've lost your stack. But if it was the difference between they swing a bunch of bodies past me on the next turn and I lose versus I stall for a turn, that can obviously be pretty impactful. And I also think the fact that it can kind of be teched as an alternative Ice Wall slot is pretty cool as well. So you can just throw this in as a one of, and then you just have access to it if you want to utilize that effect. The Ice Wall also works well in conjunction with the fact that it does have blocker. So it's something where your opponent can't swing, or if they do swing, they'll lose 4 memory, and then you'll block them, right? And so it means they're probably not getting a check in. They're likely passing turn. Yeah, it kind of just says no to your opponent's aggression for a turn, and it just kind of stalls them in their tracks. And that aspect of the card is really cool. But it's a defensive top end in a deck that really wants more aggression. So for me, it just doesn't feel great. But like I said, I think it's a B tier, reasonable tech, reasonable meta call, depending on what you're specifically worried about playing against. All right, that was the last of the level 6s, which now brings us into the level 7s. So this is basically just going to be a bunch of Omnimons for the most part. The very first one I'm going to talk about here is BT1 Omnimon. Yeah, don't run this guy. When Digivolving, he deletes all of your opponent's Digimon with the same name. You pick like a name and then it deletes all of them. And then he has like a multi-swing effect that you can use if you return stuff. Basically, he can swing multiple times. That's like not really going to come up, right? So it's not very good. It costs 6 to Digivolve into him, and you're more than likely just deleting one Digimon, unless you're playing against like Garurumon or something, at which point this card becomes S tier. I don't know, maybe not even then. But yeah, that's that card. Then we have BT13 Omnimon, which it's actually easy to forget. This is like the Royal Knights Omnimon. But it's easy to forget that in addition to his effect that you use for Royal Knights, he has an alternative effect which activates on player when Digivolving. You just delete one of your opponent's Digimon. So it's just Gaia Force, right? And basically the same as the BT1, except that it costs 2 less because it only costs 4 to Digivolve into this one. So yeah, in that regard, it's a slight improvement, but it's still D tier. All right, then the first actually good Omnimon is BT5. So BT5 Omni, often also referred to as Blitz Omni, has 2 effects. The first is, actually 3 effects, excuse me. The first is when he Digivolves, he unsuspends. Additionally, when he Digivolves, he gains Blitz. So that means that if you had a level 6 on board that was suspended, you Digivolve this on top of it, it unsuspends, it swings, even if you pass turn, and that's potentially game if your opponent only had, or was out of security right at that point. So you check through all your opponent's security, Blitz Omni for game. That's really good. obviously by itself. The second thing, though, that's actually pretty strong in this particular deck is it has an effect where once per turn, when this card would be deleted or returned to hand or bottom of deck by an effect. So basically, not battle and not something that like, throws it into security or something like that. Any other kind of removal pretty much. Then at that point, you can trash a level 6 from its sources to prevent that from happening. That's pretty solid. As I mentioned earlier, Garuru is notorious for having very little effect protection in the deck. This is a way to get that, even though you've got to be all the way up at level 7 to gain access to that. It can be pretty solid in certain circumstances. For example, if you go into BT9 Metal Guru X, you gain blocker for the turn, you swing or whatever, and then you Digivolve into Blitz Omni to pass turn. You then unsuspend. Instead of blitzing at that point, you just don't blitz, and you now have an unsuspended blocker that has effect protection and battle protection. It means it's going to be really hard to kill, and it's going to be able to block something to prevent your opponent from killing you. So that's actually a scenario where that kind of effect can be pretty relevant. This one goes right in S tier. Pretty much every deck is going to want at least one. You're probably not going to run more than two, but you're going to want to have it in there at least at one, just for at a minimum, the cheeky game ending, but it's also good outside of that. All right, then we're moving on to the Omnimon X antibody cards. The first is BT5 Omnimon X. This one is kind of interesting. So its first thing is it can Digivolve on top of Omnimon, of course, and then it has a when attacking effect where you can delete one of your opponent's Digimon, which is pretty good. It's Force, right? That's not bad at all. Particularly since if you maintain this, you can do that on every turn. So that's actually pretty decent. In addition to that, it has a kind of interesting effect where when your opponent attacks, you can trash 2 cards from the sources to just end that attack. They still trigger all of their when attacking effects and things like that, but it prevents the attack from actually resolving. That's pretty nice. This effect has no turn limit, so if you have a bunch of sources, you can just continually stop attacks. However, the issue is that, unlike Greymon, we do not have effect protection. So if you go into this card, like what's normally going to happen is your opponent's just going to blow you up, right? Instead, like, okay, I'll just have to delete that, I guess. And unlike Greymon, we can't prevent that. So yeah, that is pretty much the biggest issue, and it completely poses the intent of this card, which is kind of just your opponent can't get past it, and they can't end game until they've whittled through all of your sources. This is, I think, probably a C tier. Feels reasonable. It still has some interesting things it can do that no other card can really do, but it's hard to justify actually trying to run this. The BT10 Omni X, on the other hand, is a lot better. So it does a couple different things. Firstly, it can Digivolve from Omnimon for 3. And then if you have X antibody in the sources, then you reduce its Digivolution cost by 2. When Digivolving, you bot deck all of your opponent's highest level Digimon. So this is kind of the opposite of the BT9 Metal Garuru X. Rather than all lowest, it's all highest, and it bot decks all of them. So that's pretty crazy. Like if you do BT9 Metal X into Omni X, that's going to be a board wipe against most decks. And then the very last thing it does is when Digivolving or when attacking once per turn, you can return 1 level 6 Digimon or 1 X antibody from this card's sources to the bottom of your deck to reveal your opponent's security, and then you trash 1 card in their security, and then you return it and shuffle it and all that. So that's pretty crazy. Notably, if you're swinging for game and you activate this effect, then if they only have 1 security left, you clear that, and then your swing goes through, and that ends the game, right? Out of nowhere. All that being said, I will put this one in B tier. And the reason that this goes in B tier is specifically that in order to maximize the usefulness of this card, you pretty much have to be running the original BT9 X antibody option. The reason for this is that if you use Protoform, if you're only using Protoform, then you lose out on 2 things. One, Protoform unless you already had it in the sources, like if you were using protoform to go into this card, then even though it would reduce its cost by 1, so it would cost 6 or 2 on an Omnimon, protoform would not actually be in the sources until after the Digivolution occurred. So rather than ending up 1 cheaper, it actually ends up funnily costing 1 more than using the original X antibody in this case. So that's an issue, but that's actually a minor issue, considering that this is more of a game ender anyway. The more significant issue is the fact that if you have the original X antibody, you can do the play I was talking about earlier, where you swing at your opponent's security, you use X antibody to digivolve into OmniX, and then you trash your opponent's last security and swing for game. You cannot do that with protoform unless you're able to go into this card without passing turn, but it's normally pretty expensive to do that, so it's just a lot more difficult to actually utilize this card effectively without the OGX antibody. If you had like a Blitz Omni that you floated for a turn and then it came all the way back around, then you could digivolve this on that Omni and then clear some stuff, and maybe that's pretty good. But at that point, I think it's still, even saying that, it kind of falls into more of a tech slot, which would still put it at B tier. So yeah, don't get me wrong, this is a very strong card. Like power wise, it is way up there. It's just that you kind of have to use the OGX antibody to actually get the full use of what this card is trying to do, and that is what puts it in B tier. All right, we're getting pretty close to wrapping up the Omnimons here. The next one we have is Omnimon Merciful Mode, which is from BT9. This one's pretty interesting. It can digivolve on like 4 different colors of level 6, I think everything but purple and black. It can also digivolve on top of Omnimon. I believe Omnimon in name actually as well, so you could go on top of OmniX if you wanted to. And then when digivolving, it deletes one of your opponent's Digimon for each Digimon with Mega in its sources. So that can very easily be 2. If you have like MetalGarurumon and MetalGaruru X, and then you go into Merciful Mode, then that deletes 2. If you had like MetalGaruru X, Omni, then that would be 3. So you can actually delete pretty easily a couple cards with this, and potentially more. And then after that, you bot deck 10 cards from your opponent's trash to the bottom of their deck, and that's pretty strong for a couple different reasons. The first is that against any type of trash-based deck that's trying to like stack up cards in trash and then do something, you prevent that. So like most recently, there was Apocalypse where they would just throw stuff in trash and then make the Apocalypse. And then if you got rid of it, oh, too bad, they just drop another, right? Well, with this, you kind of get around that. You delete their Apocalypse, all their sources go to trash with it, and then you just bot deck all that stuff. So now they don't have sources anymore to use. So that's an example of how that could be useful. Another thing that's really good about that is if you delete something with an on-deletion effect, if you bot deck that card that had the on-deletion, then it doesn't trigger. So that's another instance where that effect can be pretty powerful. So yeah, it's kind of like a medical type effect, but it is pretty interesting. And then the next piece of it is on your next turn, the start of your turn, it's either start of your turn or start of your main phase, you trash the top source of this card, which is going to be the Merciful Mode. So it'll trash back down to whatever was right below that, and then you trash the top card of your opponent's security. If you put Merciful Mode on and it survives and it comes all the way back around to your turn, you pretty much win the game at that point, because you're going to have like a fully built stack. You're going to have blown up their board and trash stuff in their security. And then you trash the top card, trash their security, throw in their trash to the bottom of their deck. Like, I don't know. It's just like at that point, the game's kind of over. The thing is, you don't really need this card most of the time. It's more of just something that you only need in specific metas when there are just certain decks that are problematic that this card helps as a counter to. So like I said earlier, prior to the ban list, this would have been really good against Apocalypse. Can be good against other stuff when there's like heavily trash-based decks dominating the meta. So as a result of that, this one is going to go in B tier. All right, and then last among the Omnimons, and mostly included for completeness and kind of because I thought it was funny, we have EX4 Omnimon Alter S. So funnily, in spite of the fact that this card is intended to be a DNA Digivolution card that you use with Blitzgreymon and Garurumon, you can actually pull off all of its wind digivolving effects, even if you're not DNA digivolving. There's nothing that specifically states that you have to be DNA digivolving to gain any of its effects, which is pretty common for like DNA cards, but this one doesn't have that. So its wind digivolving is you delete one of your opponent's Digimon with 8k DP or less, and then you bot deck one of your opponent's level 6 or higher Digimon. So you can get rid of 2 bodies that way, like a lower level 1, maybe like a level 5 or below, and then a level 6 or higher, and that's pretty nice. Then additionally, when it would leave the field, you do 2 things. First, you play Garurumon and Blitzgreymon out of its sources. Obviously, we're not going to have that, so that won't happen. But then you put it on the bottom of your security. So you're basically recovering one with like a big body that your opponent's going to have to crash into for no real reason, right? So this card is actually not horrible. Like, it's a kind of funny card. It's a card that if you threw it out on somebody, they would probably be like, "Well, I was not expecting that." But it's still not really one that you're probably gonna want to run. It's, like I said, more of just a meme tech. But I think it's still worthy of a C tier. It actually has a pretty good wind digivolving effect. It's actually better than a lot of the other options. Still, just probably not too much reason to run it over something like OmniX or Merciful Mode. And then the last of the level 7s that I want to talk about is the BT6 Garurumon Bond of Friendship. This one is pretty good for Bond. You're playing Bond. In fact, actually, it's not pretty good. It's very good. It's S tier for Bond, but we're not Bond, right? So there's not a ton of reason to try to utilize this one in this deck. It can still work. If you want to try to run the BT6 mat and you want to have Bond as like a secondary win condition in the deck, I don't think that's the worst idea. But at that point, you're kind of talking about an entirely separate deck. I feel like it's kind of morphed into something different at that point. It's more of like a Bond with Metal Garuru teched in as opposed to a Metal Garuru deck. So I'm not really going to be considering that case too much. I'm more going to be looking at how good it is within this deck. And here, the biggest thing that it gives you is pretty much just an extra swing. It can digivolve on top of a level 6 blue for 3. And then once per turn when you're attacking, you can unsuspend. You can also bot deck like a level 5 or lower Digimon. So you could, if your Metal Garurumon was unsuspended, you could digivolve into this. You could get an extra swing. But that's just way worse than Blitz Omni, right? Blitz Omni is already doing that, and it does that even if it passes turn. So it's kind of just difficult to justify even trying to use this one over Blitz Omni if you're using it purely for that purpose. The biggest thing that it does do, which is actually not bad, is since it is blue and has Gabumon in name, it's actually a lot easier to search than Omnimon because it can be picked up by Training, Boost, Davis, it can be picked up by EX1 Gabumon, it can be picked up by BT15 Matt. So it's a lot easier to get to hand. You can also technically use Training to digivolve into it for 1, which is kind of funny. But yeah, this is all the type of thing that would probably only happen in some kind of off games. So I think this one is more of a C tier pick. If you want to make a deck that's more heavily based around it, like a Bond based deck, of course it's going to be S tier there. But here it's more of like a kind of just a worse Blitz Omni. All right, that is it for the level 7s, which means that we are pretty much in the home stretch now. We just have some tamers to discuss as well as some options. So starting off with the tamers, I'm just going to go ahead and immediately throw BT15 Matt in S tier. I have been discussing this guy all video. Pretty much he's come up at various different points with other Digimon. And yeah, just a great card. First thing it does is on play, you reveal the top 3 cards of your deck, and you add 1 Digimon with Gabumon or Garurumon in its name to the hand, which means it can search basically anything in your deck except for Omnimon. That's pretty nice. Its second effect is that once per turn, or well, rather on your turn, when you add a card to hand by a Digimon effect, which can be like drawing by effect or searching by a Digimon effect, then you can suspend Matt to gain 1 memory, which is also really good. Particularly in a longer game, like in a game where you trigger this guy multiple times, it's really going to start to add up. If you can stack multiple mats on board, that's really going to start to add up because if you have 2 mats, every time that you pull this off, you trigger, you gain 2 memory instead of just the 1. So it becomes pretty nice if you stack it. It can be free played. by EX1 Garurumon and BT15 Garurumon. You can just play it from hand yourself because it's just an on-play searcher that sits up for memory on later turns. It's maybe a slightly weaker searcher than like something like training if you have to play it from hand manually, but it's still solid. You know, the fact that you can use it multiple times over the course of a game is really good as well. So yeah, just a very solid all-around card. Not one that you have to necessarily instantly max on or anything. Like you might just run 3 or something like that, but it's still a really good card. It enables our BT15 Metal Guru warp. I think I forgot to mention it earlier, but when you want to warp into that, in addition to your opponent having to have a 10k or higher DP Digimon, you also have to control a Matt Ishida in-name tamer. So there is that condition as well, and this card immediately satisfies that. So that's great for that as well. Yeah, just a really good card, really nice addition. I was very happy when it was revealed. Next up, we have the BT16 Matt. As I mentioned, this one is mostly going to be useful if you want to try to do, or not BT16, sorry, BT6. This one is mostly going to be useful if you want to try to do, bond shenanigans, right? I guess that's the big thing that it comes from. So in a bond deck, it's going to be S tier, of course, but for us, it's more of a C tier card. Now, even outside of using bond, it's actually not horrible, because you can do a couple different things with it. The first is that at the start of, or rather, when you move out of raising, you gain 1 memory and you draw 1 card. So that's pretty good. You know, it's like probably it's not worth including really for that, but that's actually not bad. If you set it up, then you can move out, and it can also be free played in a couple different ways because it is a 3-cost mat. So that piece of it's actually good as well. Again, not something that you're probably ever really going to want to include, but it's functional, you know. So yeah, that kind of puts it in the C tier range for me. The next one up is the ST16 Matt Ishida, which is the purple memory setter mat. So in addition to being a memory setter, it also has an effect where all turns once per turn, well, all turns rather, you can suspend it. So basically once per turn. When you trash a card from your hand to gain 1 memory. That's pretty solid because it's on the top of being a memory setter. It can potentially also give you an additional memory, 1 memory on top of that. So it can actually, you know, give you basically set you to 4 if you have the ability to trash something rather than just setting you to 3 is one way to think about it. The big problem with this card, which isn't a huge problem, but the main problem with this card is just that in the non-purple base deck, especially after the ban list, where Gabu X, EX5 Gabu X, and Garuru X have gone to 1, there is just way less crashing than there was before, right? So it's just much harder to be guaranteeing that you're going to be pulling this card's effect off frequently, which I think is like one of the things that helps justify it. Is like if you can pull it off like pretty much every turn, then that's pretty good, right? So when you don't have that, you're not going to be getting that. And for me, I think that puts it in B tier because you have to make sure that your deck actually has enough trashing to really justify it. Like for example, the Where Guru Ace can trash, but you have to be running that. The Metal Guru Ace can trash, but again, you have to be running that. ST16 Where Guru can also trash. So there's multiple different cards that you could run, but you just need to be running them. So yeah, that puts it in B tier. And then the last of the mats that I'm going to discuss today is the BT9 Matt Ishida and Sora Takenouchi. This one's actually not too bad. It's kind of interesting. The first thing is it is a 4-cost tamer. It is half blue, half red, which is pretty cool in some ways because it does enable you to use red options. There aren't a lot that we would really ever consider in this deck. The main one that comes to mind would be something like a Delicate Plan to be able to avoid triggering security options. That is something that it does bring to the table. In addition to that, at the start of your main phase, if you have 8 or more cards in hand, or if your opponent has 8 or more cards in hand, then you gain 1 memory for each. So if your opponent has it, you gain 1. If you have it, you gain 1. If you both do, then you'd be gaining 2, right? Which is pretty good because most of the time that's going to be true, particularly a little bit later into a game, which means that this card can be kind of a stand-in for a memory setter. So that's not too bad. And then the last effect is when your blue or red Digimon unsuspends, you can suspend this tamer to bounce one of your opponent's level 3 Digimon to the hand. Pretty strange effect for a tamer to have, to be honest. Like Digimon removal is just kind of odd for this kind of tamer, especially around the time it came out. But there it is, right? You have it on there, so not too bad in that regard. It can be played by BT15 Garurumon, provided you don't have a mat on the field already, for a reduced cost of 3. So it would cost 1, which is that's not too bad. Yeah, I think it's like an okay card. I wouldn't call it great. It's not one that I would ever personally run in my build, but I don't think it's like I don't think it's definitely not D tier. So we'll go ahead and throw that in the C there. Now there are actually quite a few other cards that have Matt Ishida in the name, but for the sake of not just populating the the D tier with like a bunch of other mats for no real reason. I'll just go ahead and say that any mat that is not pictured here is, in my opinion, D tier for this deck. Either because it's just bad, like some of the older mats, for example, just aren't very good, like the BT1 mat is bad, or because it's not really doing what this deck is trying to do. So, for example, some of the like the mat and tie that is intended to be used in Alter S obviously has no real place here, like D tier here. So, anything like that would be in D tier. And like I said, just to save time and save space, I'm not going to go through any of those. So if you don't see a mat pictured here, it's not worth running. But yeah, that's it for the mats. We do have a few more tamers to discuss. The first is Davis. So this is a pretty straightforward card, staple blue tamer for a very long time. It's a memory setter, and then in addition to that, on play, you reveal the top 3 cards of your deck. You add 1 blue and 1 green Digimon to the hand. Obviously, we're not running any green Digimon, but we do have blues. And what that means is this card is basically a memory setter that is also a searcher, which basically helps counter the big issue that memory setter tamers have, which is that when you have to spend 4 memory playing a memory setter, it just feels pretty bad. But since this one also searches, it's much less painful to use during the setup phase of the game. It's very similar, honestly, functionally pretty similar to Blue Memory Boost in how it acts. It just costs 1 more and searches 1 less. But in a longer game, it's going to give you more memory over the course of that game. So not a bad card at all. Can't be free played or anything, of course, but even so, I still think it falls into A tier. It's a very solid search option that if you want to run it, you can very easily find 1 slot or 2 slots or whatever to slot it into your deck if you want. So for me, that puts it into A tier. For the record, I don't necessarily think it's strictly better than the ST16 mat as a memory setter, because the ST16 mat does have the advantage of being able to be played for 1 by the BT15 Garuru. But I do think if we're not counting that scenario, if you're just having to play 1 from hand, then I think Davis is going to generally be the preferred because, again, it searches. So that's something to note as well. All right, after that, we have Cool Boy. So Cool Boy is another on-play searcher tamer, which is great. It also only costs 2, which is also great. And what it does is it reveals the top 3 cards of your deck. You can add 1 Digimon with X antibody in its traits and 1 option with the X antibody trait from the deck to hand. And then the next effect is that when you digivolve into an X antibody Digimon on the same level. So for example, if you go Garurumon into Garurumon X antibody, or like Gabu into Gabu X, then you can suspend this tamer to gain 1 memory and draw 1 card. And that right there is the real allure of Cool Boy. If you go up a tier, then normally that's going to be free, or if it's like a higher tier, maybe it's going to cost 1. So you're either like netting positive memory, or you're at least breaking even, in addition to like getting an extra draw, which is nice. The other thing that's really cool with it is if you stack multiple Cool Boys, then you're getting multiple memory and multiple draws. And like when you get like 2 or 3 Cool Boys, particularly if you get 2, like honestly, once you get to 2 Cool Boys on field, it starts to feel pretty crazy. Like when it's just 1, it's like, okay, that's okay. But like 2 plus Cool Boys, ooh man, that feels really strong. Now for me personally, I'm not as big of a fan of this card anymore. And I normally don't run it because I don't like how it only hits the X antibody cards, which is not there's a lot of your deck that you can't pick up with Cool Boy, and a lot of your non-X antibody cards are actually still pretty important. So I don't like how it whiffs so much of the deck, but it's definitely still a strong option. Not one that I can justify putting any lower than A tier. It's a very solid card to consider. And it's also worth mentioning that even if you do whiff, you can somewhat mitigate this issue by gaining the draw from its suspend effect. So it's like, okay, you whiff the search, but then you get a draw. So that can kind of still work out in your favor. But yeah, for me, I don't like it as much as some of the other options, but it's still a very solid option to run. Definitely goes in the A tier. And then the last tamer to discuss is BT5 Nokia Shiramine. So she's kind of interesting. On play, she plays a Gabumon or Agumon from your hand. And then on your turn, when you digivolve into a Garurumon or a Greymon, you can suspend her to reduce the cost by 1. And that's actually not bad at all, really. The big problem with her, though, is that a couple different things. Firstly, in terms of these kind of like gain 1 memory tamers, she is very outclassed by Matt and even Cool Boy. They're both, like, Matt can be free played. Matt is also easier to trigger. Matt also searches on play. Cool Boy searches on play. Cool Boy also draws cards. Cool Boy is cheaper. So in terms of those kind of things, like, she's kind of just outclassed by those cards. And then the other issue that she runs into is that she can only play Gabumon specifically, she cannot play Gabumon X Antibody. And as a result, the most searcher Gabumons you're probably going to be running in your deck is like 4 at best. So you would have to have one of those in hand in order to really benefit from this. You would also probably need another level 3 so that you could have one in Raising and then maybe play one out with her. So it's just not very consistent to actually have a good card to drop with her. And then even in the best case scenario where you do, the end result of all of that is still basically just comparable to what you're getting with BT15 Matt, because you're getting the memory effect and then you're getting a search if you play BT5 Gabumon. But Matt is already giving you a search and has a memory gain effect. So it's like, yeah, this card, I will say it's not directly outclassed. It does free play something, which nothing else really does, but it's still just not a very good option. It's C tier for sure. Honestly, borderline D tier. I think this one has been a little bit more eclipsed than even some of the other options. So yeah, that's where I would put it. All right, that is the end of the tamers that I'm covering. So we're in options now, which is the very last thing we need to talk through. And we have a few different ones here. I'll go ahead and say the type of options I'm talking through are going to be the ones that you always going to be running in the deck, like the X Antibody options, some of the staple cards like Training and Boost. And then I'm going to be also talking through any of the options that specifically reference Gabumon or Garurumon in their text. And the reason I'm talking through those is that, especially for newer players or people who are newer to the deck, I've noticed I've seen some builds where people will be like trying to throw in those cards. I guess when you're reading them, and particularly if you're new to a deck or new to the game in general, maybe you think, oh, I guess I should be running this card. But the reality is that most of these cards are not actually very good, especially for this deck. But that also tends to be true elsewhere. So you'll notice when we get to that point, a lot of those are going to be tiered on the lower end. But I wanted to at least talk through them to kind of just cover those for newer players and just let people know, hey, these ones aren't actually too much worth running. So anyway, getting right into it, we'll go ahead and discuss the X Antibody options first. The first one I want to talk about is BT9 X Antibody. So BT9, you can play it to slot it under one of your Digimon. It goes to the bottom of their sources. It can't be trashed, which is nice in some matchups. And then it has an effect of when attacking, you can Digivolve into a Digimon with X Antibody in its traits. You can't ignore Digivolution conditions with this, but you can either Digivolve from like the same name, so WereGaruru to WereGaruru-X, or you could do something like WereGaruru into MetalGaruru-X, because that would be a valid a path that you can do. You couldn't do like Gabu into WereGaruru-X. Something like that doesn't work. So, but in any case, yeah, that's the main effect of it. And then it also has a security effect where it gains 1 memory and then adds to your hand. So it's kind of like a half Hammer Spark, half Ice Wall in security, and then you also get it to hand, which is cool. This card is it was originally the standard X Antibody. It was the only X Antibody until Protoform, and it's still good. It's a card that is very easy to use. You're not really going to run into any issues if you run it. You can run this and not Protoform at all, and the deck will still perform fine. It'll just be a little bit less memory efficient and not have some of the recursion that Protoform gives. It also does work well in certain scenarios. For example, if you want to utilize the BT10 OmniX, like I mentioned earlier, this card is great for that. It's also really good if you want to trigger 2 effects before your opponent has an ability to react. So as an example, if you're on MetalGarurumon Ace, you can swing it, activate its when attacking, delete their lowest level, then activate X Antibody, Digivolve into BT9 Metal X, unsuspend, then bounce all their lowest levels, something like that, right? So maybe you can clear 2 things in one go before your opponent has a chance to do anything, like, for example, if they were going to block, or if they were going to blast Digivolve on top of one of the Digimon, maybe you can clear it that way. Certain matchups, that ends up being kind of situational or a little bit matchup dependent how useful that aspect is, but in the right situations, that can be absolutely game-changing. So that aspect of the card is really nice. I will say I do think it is still not the favored option in comparison to Protoform, which I'll discuss in just a moment, but it still goes in the A tier because it's not a build specific card. It's not, it's not build dependent. It's not one that you will have any issues if you include it in your build. You can kind of just easily throw it in there in reasonable ratios, and it'll do perfectly fine. So I think A tier is still a good place for it. Protoform, on the other hand, I'll go ahead and just say this will be in S tier, because you really probably are going to want at least a couple of this in your deck. You don't strictly have to run it, but it's really helpful if you do throw it in for a few different reasons. So this card does a few different things. It's kind of interesting effect-wise. The first is when you activate it, you can Digivolve into a Digimon with X anybody in its traits for one less than usual, and then you plug the Protoform in as the bottom of its sources. So it works kind of similarly to Training, where it's like an effect that you activate, that you Digivolve as part of the effect. And then it lets you do it for one less, as opposed to like two less, like you do with Training. So this is most impactful if you're either skipping a tier. So for example, if you're going from a level 4 into a level 5, or alternatively, if you're Digivolving into one where it costs 1. The most notable ones being the EX5 Garurumon X, or the MetalGarurumon, MetalGarurumon X cards, which both cost 1 on top of a MetalGarurumon. In either of those cases, you're making that for free to do that Digivolution, so that's pretty huge, especially for the Garurumon X. That one costing 1 is really the only bad part of the card, and making it free is very impactful to helping that card really accomplish the full extent of what you can do with it. So that aspect of it already really good. So that's great. In addition to that, though, you get an interesting inherit, which is when this Digimon would leave the battle area, except by your own effect, I believe, you return 1 card from its sources to your hand, and then Protoform goes to the top of your security. That's pretty weird. It's a very weird effect, really, but it's great. It's actually pretty amazing. You're getting a free recovery for basically no reason. The fact that your opponent tried to out your stack, cool. You can get that in a deck that obviously there's normally no recovery at all in this deck, so getting that for no particular reason is awesome. And then you also get a piece back to hand, so you get back something that you could use on a subsequent stack. Like if you're going to lose a stack anyway, then you get back whatever the most important piece is, or the piece that you're missing in hand, and you can start building again. That's really good. Like I kind of mentioned with EX5 WereX earlier, if you're with all these limited cards, you can add back one of the limited cards to your hand for reuse. That's pretty nice. So that aspect is really good. The other thing worth mentioning there is that triggers even if you prevent your deletion. So as an example, if you swing in and you're going to die in security, and so you battle protect, even if you battle protect, the Protoform is still a mandatory trigger that happens after that. So you'll both get the battle protection and you'll trigger Protoform. So that's pretty silly, particularly if you still have more X Anybody forms to go up into, because if you have another Protoform in hand, then boom, okay, you Protoform again, go up for one less another time. So you can do some goofy stuff like that. Also happens, if you evade with the BT15 MetalGarurumon as well. That would be like another scenario where that can come up. And the Recover 1 is really good. It's really good in general because it's just one more card that your opponent has to get through. But it actually becomes pretty ridiculous when you do it multiple times in a game. Like I've had some games where I've Protoformed like 3 times, and when you're recovering, 2 or 3 times in a game, it starts to get pretty crazy. The other thing to mention with that is that this Protoform security effect, when your opponent hits it in security, it just adds to your hand. It does not gain a memory like the original X Anybody. That would be crazy. But it does still add to your hand, which means that you, like I said, you can then reuse it. So if the game's not over at that point, you get it back out there. If it's going to die again, you throw it in security again. The fact that it just cycles pieces and cycles itself so easily and recovers cards. Yeah, it's just a crazy card. Reduces play costs. It has a lot going on. I remember when it first was revealed, I was like, I don't know about this. But then when I got in and was actually starting to play it some, I'm like, okay, yeah, this card is insane. Next up, we have Mental Training. So this card is a searcher option. You reveal the top 2 cards of your deck. You take 1 blue card from among those and add it to your hand. And the other goes to the bottom of the deck. Then on a later turn, its delay effect is you trash it to Digivolve into a blue Digimon for 2 less than usual. So these cards are crazy. Unless you're new to the game, you've probably seen training. You've probably seen how strong training is. And I don't think I really need to talk too much to that, but I will kind of just mention a couple notes for those newer players, which is that some of the big aspects of training. Firstly, it can pick up any blue card. Most searchers have some limitations. So for example, Blue Memory Boost only picks up Digimon, Davis only picks up Digimon, things like that, right? The training cards pick up anything in the appropriate color, which means it can pick up options, which is rare. It can pick up tamers, which is really nice, also somewhat rare. And it can pick up Digimon as well, of course. And it can also pick up itself. Like there's no limitation on that. So you can training, you reveal 2 cards, one of them is a training. Okay. If you're still wanting to search, if you're wanting to set up more, you pick up the training again. So you can easily set up a lot with training. The fact that it also only costs 2 is really nice because there's a good chance that you don't pass turn on it, which means that maybe you can play multiple setup cards in a turn, or like play this and then go up 1 tier in raising or something like that. Yeah, I mean, really the only negative of this card is the fact that like you have to be on board to utilize its effect. So you can't use it until you come out of raising, the delay effect. But the fact that it costs 2 and then reduces the cost by 2 means that it completely pays for itself. Like you're not costing yourself any extra memory by doing a search, unlike with something like Blue Memory Boost, for example, where it costs 3, but you only get back 2. So yeah, just crazy card. It can pick up mat as well, which is huge, because if you do training and then you get a mat out of it, and then you either play the mat or you cheat out the mat with one of your Garurumons on a subsequent turn, that is awesome. Like using training to Digivolve in a BT15 Guru for free, and then dropping a mat off that, getting a search, you get another draw after that, then you trigger the mat. Like you can do a lot of cool shenanigans with that. Anyway, this card is standard for like pretty much all stack decks. Training cards are, and it's really good here as well. So S tier easily. After that, we have Blue Memory Boost, which I kind of discussed a little bit there. It's a companion card of training. I guess you could say the predecessor of training. On play, it reveals the top 4 cards of your deck, and it adds 1 blue Digimon from among those to the hand and returns the rest to the bottom of the deck. Very deep search there. You get to search through 4 cards, which is pretty nice. If you're missing a piece, you should hopefully have it after that. If not, you're 4 cards closer. Then on a subsequent turn, you can trash it to gain 2 memory. So that's a little bit more easy to utilize than the training effect, because it can be used for just 2 generic memory. It doesn't have to be any specific thing that you're doing. Like you don't have to digivolve up a tier to gain advantage of that. You don't even have to move out of raising. The flexibility of that is actually very nice. The biggest downside of it is it costs 3, so you pay 3, but you only get back 2. That's actually not too bad though, because sometimes having different memory cost things to set your opponent to different amounts of memory is actually pretty good. But then the other main downside is that it only picks up Digimon, so you can't grab other searchers. You notably end up bot decking your mats. So, there's some issues with the card, but it's still a very good searcher card, very good setup card, and it goes right in A tier. You can easily throw this in a build to fill out, like if you have a couple slots you're trying to fill out, and you're like, oh, what should I run here? If the rest of your lines look pretty solid, then Boost is a great option, just to boom, fill out the rest of the deck. All right, after that we have Ice Wall. So Ice Wall is included here mostly because it is often considered to be a blue staple. It's limited to 1, which means it often, it gets thrown into builds a lot just because it's like an easy one of include. I will say for me personally, I think its staple status has fallen a lot over time. Like it used to be a definite, like, yeah, you're spending a slot on that. But now it's much more arguable whether you want to include it or not. So I guess I should get into what it does first, which is that you pay 1 memory, and then you apply a blanket effect to your opponent's field where whenever they attack, they lose 2 memory. So basically for a turn, every time they attack, it's going to cost them some memory. In addition to that, it has a pretty good, actually a pretty, I'll say annoying security effect for your opponent, where when they hit it in security, they just, you gain 2 memory. So that makes them lose memory they would not be expecting to on their turn when they're swinging at your security. And then potentially, if they hit it, if they're at 1 memory or 0 memory, then they will pass turn over to you. That can be pretty pretty dangerous if that happens to occur. But the thing with this card is that whether you choose to run it or not, rather than being a staple, it's now more of just a tech. You can run it if you want. You can run it if you think it's favorable in the meta, and run it if you just like it, or if you just have an open slot and you're like, I don't know what else to put here. Icewall is great in that regard, but it's definitely not like an auto include or anything anymore. I don't even think I would personally put it at the A tier level. It's probably borderline A tier because if somebody has Icewall in their deck, you're never going to be like, oh man, why are you running that? Like, it's perfectly fine. It's a perfectly fine card, but I do feel like it's how much merit it has does fluctuate a bit with the state of the meta, and as a result, for me, I would put it in B tier. All right, now with that, we're getting into the cards that reference Gabumon or Garurumon that I was mentioning earlier. And so we've got 5 of those to talk through, so we'll just kind of go through those relatively quickly. The first here is Supreme Cannon. So it costs 3, and its effect is you return all of your opponent's Digimon with 3k or less DP to the hand. If you control a Garurumon or an Omnimon, Digimon with Garurumon or Omnimon in name, then you return all of their Digimon with 5k DP or less to the hand instead. Its security effect, I believe, is exactly the same. That is like okay, right? It's an okay card. It's kind of similar to Crimson Blaze, if you're familiar with that card. That one deletes a bunch of stuff. This one bounces stuff instead, which is actually pretty nice. But the big problem with the card is that, well, two issues. Firstly, in a lot of scenarios, its security effect is just going to be absolutely useless. Like your opponent hits it in security, they don't have low-level Digimon, okay, doesn't matter. If your opponent has, even if they have a bunch of Digimon, okay, unlike Crimson Blaze, which hits 6k and below, this one is only hitting 3k unless you control a Garurumon. Even if you do control a Garurumon, you're only bouncing some of the level 4s because some level 4s are sitting at like 6k, so they wouldn't even be in that 5k threshold. Or if they have DP boosts or anything like that, maybe they're above what even gets bounced. So that's pretty unfortunate. You're only really safely bouncing level 3s for sure, even with a Garurumon on board, and maybe like lower DP level 4s. So yeah, it's just not great. It's pretty weak even for what it's attempting to accomplish. The other big issue is that spending 3 memory over on this versus like spending 3 memory on, I don't know, anything else, it just feels hard to justify. I think there's maybe an argument for putting this in C tier, but for me, I actually think it goes in D tier because it's just a type of card. It's like a trap. I'll say it that way. When you read it, it doesn't sound too bad, and you might even say like, oh, I could understand how this could be good in some metas, but it really is just a trap card that is going to waste a slot in your deck, basically. Waste a slot that could be spent on something better. And the same type of thing is true for BT15 Foxfire. I'm also going to put this one in E tier for a similar reason. Now, I actually think between the two, I think Foxfire is the slightly better card because, firstly, it only requires having a Gabumon or Garurumon in name on field to increase its effect. So even if you just have a Gabumon, you can do something from there, which is nice. Its normal effect is bounces, I believe, a level 4 or lower to the hand. And then if you control Gabumon or Garurumon, you bounce their lowest level instead. The funny thing about that is it's not you may bounce their lowest level instead, you just do. So that can actually be bad sometimes. Like if your opponent has, let's say they have a level 3 and a 4, well, if you control a Gabumon or a Garurumon, now you have to bounce the 3. You don't get to bounce the 4 anymore. So that kind of sucks, right? I wish it had been flexible. It seems like it should have been, just to let you choose an alternative target if you wanted to. But in any case, that means this is pretty much going to be the best against single stack decks. If you can just bounce their stack, then it's actually a pretty good, pretty decent card at that point. But I think the fact that it requires you controlling stuff on board to get the most usefulness out of it, that same issue applies if it being in security or something as well. So that aspect is kind of bad. It only costs 4, which is okay, but at the same time, if you're spending 4 memory, there's a lot of better stuff you could be doing with that. You could be progressing a line, something like that. And then also the fact that it's just a lot harder to control its targeting. I think it's hard to justify using this card over using something like, say, Full Moon Meteor Impact, which just targets any Digimon and bounces it, which is effectively not going to cost much more anyway. So yeah, this one is just too situational to merit, in my opinion. All right, next up after that we have BT9 Metal Storm. So this one does a couple different things. Firstly, it costs 7, but if you have a Digimon with X antibody in its sources, then it only costs 5, so that's not bad. Then its effect is it bounces a level 6 or lower Digimon to the hand, and it unsuspends one of your Digimon with Garurumon in the name. So the idea with this card is supposed to be that you're at Metal Guru X, you use this option, you bounce one of your opponent's Digimon to the hand, and then you unsuspend the Metal Garurumon, which means that your blocker is re-enabled. The idea is not bad, but in practice, I feel like it's just worse than, again, using something like Full Moon Meteor Impact. The fact that it only bounces 6s and below is problematic. Like, you can't hit 7s with it. It also, even if you reduce the cost, like, you have to have Hex Antibody in your sources to reduce the cost, but that reduces it to just 5. Otherwise, it's going to be 7. Full Moon Meteor Impact, you gain a memory for every 4 cards in your opponent's hand. Most of the time, your opponent's probably going to have 8 or more. So normally, Full Moon Meteor Impact is probably going to cost 6, maybe cost 5 if you're lucky. So it's going to be only slightly more expensive than this one in its optimal case, possibly the same. And then in the normal case, if you don't have X Antibody in your sources, which might be true, if you're throwing down a removal option, there's a good chance that you're not very established, then it actually ends up being more expensive. So yeah, I think this one for me is just C tier. It's actually not bad. It's better than the other 2 options we just talked about, but it's not something that I think I would personally run. Even if you want to run like just a high cost removal option, I think you're way better off running Full Moon Meteor Impact or maybe even Great Maelstrom. So I would probably look at either of those instead. All right, and then up from here, we have the BT15 Wolf of Friendship. So this one's kind of interesting. It's a 4-cost option. It lets you digivolve your Gabumon directly into Metal Garurumon without paying its cost by slotting in a Garurumon and Garurumon from your trash as its bottom sources, I believe. So you don't pay the cost of the Digimon, but you pay 4 to use it. So basically, you're paying 4 to go from Gabumon to Metal Garurumon. And you pick up 2 sources, that's cool, I guess. Issues. Issue 1, the Metal Garurumon that this released alongside of BT15 Metal Garurumon already has a warp condition. So, like, okay, well, that one already warps. You don't need this option to do that. So it feels odd to me that those came out at the same time, I guess. But even if we say, okay, we'll talk about other Metal Garurumons, the big thing with it is the most useful situation I could think of would be warping straight from Gabumon to Metal Garurumon Ace, because then if you trash 3 cards in hand, you have effectively gone from Gabumon to a level 6 for 1, which is cool. That's pretty good, actually. But the big problem is that you're spending a slot on a card that maybe lets you do this warp on like a second stack, because you need the Garurumon and the Garurumon in trash, which probably means you've already lost the stack. But then again, the BT15 Metal Guru can already warp on a second stack, which if your opponent's established a board, then you're going to have access to that. Anyway, you can kind of tell it's just very situational. But yeah, I don't know. I think this one is C tier. Like I think it has some applications, but it's again just not really worth running in a typical build. You're probably not going to want to include this, but as a one of, I suppose it's not the worst thing in the world, just definitely not advisable. All right, and that brings us to the very last card that I'm going to discuss here, which is Lament of Friendship. This is from ST16. Kind of interesting option. It's a 3-cost. You can add back any Digimon from your trash to the hand. Doesn't have a level or trait or color requirement or anything like that. It's just any Digimon. And also, one of your Garurumon gains an effect where when it's deleted, it plays back for free. Doesn't have any of its sources or anything. It'll just play back just the body. So that's kind of bad for certain decks, this card is actually pretty crazy. Like, this is a very good card in Security Control. It was a very good card in Apocalypse. It's not that useful here. We can already add cards back from the trash with EX5 Werguru X in Digivolving if we really need to. The deletion effect that your Garurumon gains isn't great because your opponent would have to delete it by an effect or something, and then you're going to play back with no sources. It's just not very good in that regard. Not really any reason to consider it for this deck. It's going in E tier. All right, so yeah, that's the very last card. If you've stayed with me this far, then props to you. I know that's a lot of information. Could also mention that there are quite a few other blue options that you could potentially consider. Actually, there's technically any blue option in the game, right? You could consider. So of course, I'm not going to go through all of those, and that list will just perpetually grow. But any one that's not covered here is pretty much going to be B tier or below, because it is by definition basically going to be either a tech, a meta call, or bad, right? So it's pretty much going to fit in there. I know I had mentioned like Full Moon Meteor Impact before several times. Like that would be a B tier card, for example. So there's lots of different things you could consider, but yeah, they're all going to kind of fall into that tech category from this point. But anyway, that's our tier list. I hope you found this informative. Like I said, I hope this can help you think about how you want to build your deck. Maybe help you make something that feels more true to you or fits your own mold, rather than just going and copying a list you saw online or on a YouTube video or something like that. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but I hope that this can help some people who are getting into the deck. And yeah, that's all I have for today. So I'll leave this up on screen for just a moment. If you want to read through this anymore, or copy this for your purposes, you may want to pause the video now. But if not, that's it. This is Bancho Ethan signing off.